Mr. Byrne.
The challenge that we've got, though, is that the Bank of England now forecasts that wage growth is going to slow down. Joseph Rowntree Foundation says that earnings for the bottom 40% are going to fall by £700 a year. The Office of Budget Responsibility says real household disposable income is going to fall to almost zero in a couple of years' time. Resolution Foundation says that the freeze on tax thresholds means that the real wage growth for the poorest will get obliterated. We've got council tax going up by 5%, food going up 4.5%, we've got energy bills up 10%, water bills up 26%, and Joseph Rowntree
lying around. Right. But secondly, then to think that it's a good idea in front of the nation to say we've got all this spare housing, and what we're now going to be doing with it is we're going to be putting lots of asylum seekers in it. Now, I mean, firstly, he's wrong. I mean, he's obviously factually wrong about the state of the housing stock. Secondly, politically, it is absolutely insane in the current environment to be going around saying, oh, guess what? We've got all this, we've suddenly found all these spare houses and we're going to give them all to asylum seekers. But I mean, I don't understand what he thought he was doing. I mean, I've spoken and written a lot about how Keir Starmer does not have a political brain, right? He just isn't good at politics. But you don't have to be a master politician to understand firstly, what the facts are in relation to housing in this country, and secondly, what the public mood is in relation to housing. And
tension filled the committee room as the debate unfolded. Keir Starmer faced a panel determined to scrutinise the government's promises against a backdrop of bleak economic forecasts. At the centre of the discussion was a pledge Starmer had made repeatedly over the past year, that by the end of this Parliament, Britons across every income bracket would feel financially better off. The session quickly turned into a battle over whether that promise was realistic, as recent reports painted a far darker picture.
Prime Minister, thank you. You said at the top of the meeting that your vision for 3 years' time is that, in your words, I want people to feel better off. Just so we're absolutely clear, is the ambition that everybody in our society should feel better off in 3 years' time, including the poorest 40% of households?
Yes.
So you'll be aware of some quite troubling forecasts from, for example, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation that says that, in fact, having looked at all the measures that the government's announced on the table by the summer, the bottom 40% of households are not going to be better off in 3 years' time. They're actually going to be £1,200 a year worse off. So what do you think needs to change between now and the end of the Parliament so that everybody in our society is in fact enjoying higher living standards?
Well, we need to do a number of things. The first is we've got to get much better growth into our economy and create more wealth in the first place, and that's why we've put so much store on ensuring that we took necessary measures at the budget to deal with our inheritance. We then had a spending review which was targeted across the country. This question of making sure that if there is a thriving economy, it's a thriving economy in every part of the country and not just in some parts of the country. And it's why we've already in the spending review focused on things like the living wage, the national wage, and the minimum wage, and ensuring that wages are going up. They've gone up more in the last 10 months. They went in the...
Data presented during the meeting showed that the poorest 40% of households were projected to lose an average of £1,200 sterling, 0 pence annually by the time the government's plans were fully implemented. Rising council tax, surging utility bills and higher mortgage costs were set to erode the modest gains offered by policies like increased minimum wages and universal credit adjustments. Economists from multiple independent foundations warned that, without dramatic intervention, most low-income families would continue to see declining living standards over the next 3 years. The session exposed the widening gap between the government's rhetoric and the economic reality facing millions. As pressure mounted in the room, Starmer began outlining the measures he believed would stabilise the economy, but critics accused him of offering recycled talking points rather than real solutions.
Poverty strategy that has to ensure that this is across the whole of society and every location, because in addition, as you all know, to the growth figures, we've had inequality variances across the country, place by place, and we have to have a laser focus on that, because whilst we want more wealth creation and the economy to thrive, and we do and we will, we can't have that as London and the South East and redistribution as a sort of one-word answer for the rest of the country. To my mind, that is fundamentally wrong.
Starmer turned to the familiar talking point of growth. He emphasised that the government's economic strategy hinged on fuelling expansion across all regions, not just London and the South East. He argued that wage increases, national living wage reforms and a renewed poverty strategy were central to ensuring households would see gains by the next election. He cited rising wages over the past year as evidence that the approach was working, noting that earnings had grown more in the past 10 months than in the preceding decade. But his argument met sharp resistance. Independent watchdogs, including the Bank of England and the Resolution Foundation, had already warned that wage growth was set to slow significantly in the coming months. Inflation was driving household expenses higher at a rate that far outpaced pay increases, and tax threshold freezes threatened to erode the real value of workers' incomes. Meanwhile, food prices had climbed over 4%, energy bills surged by 10%, and water costs had jumped by more than a quarter. For many families, any wage increase was being swallowed before it could make a difference.
Mr. Ben.
The challenge that we've got, though, is that the Bank of England now forecasts that wage growth is going to slow down. Joseph Rowntree Foundation says that earnings for the bottom 40% are going to fall by £700 a year. The Office of Budget Responsibility says real household disposable income is going to fall to almost zero in a couple of years' time. Resolution Foundation says that the freeze on tax thresholds means that the real wage growth for the poorest will get obliterated. We've got council tax going up by 5%, food going up 4.5%, we've got energy bills up 10%, water bills up 26%, and Joseph Rowntree Foundation says that for those coming off fixed-term mortgages, they're going to be paying on average £1,400 a year extra by the end of this Parliament. Similarly, poor picture and outlook for renters. So we've got taxes and bills that are rising faster than wages. So the question remains, what else do you think is needed over the next year or two so that everybody is enjoying higher living standards by the time of the next election?
Well, if I just concentrate on two aspects of that. Firstly, the income side and then the cost side. On the income side, obviously, we have already pulled the lever of increasing minimum wages, which is on average of, I think, about £1,400 extra into everybody in effectively 3 million of the lowest lowest paid, above inflation increases for standard rates of universal credit. And then
the debate grew tense as committee members pressed Starmer for concrete solutions. They questioned whether incremental policies could truly counter a projected decline in disposable income, particularly for renters and homeowners coming off fixed-term mortgage deals, who were bracing for thousands in added yearly costs. Starmer shifted his focus to the relief measures his government had already introduced. He pointed to the increase in the minimum wage, which would put an estimated £1,400 sterling, 0 pence, extra in the pockets of 3 million low-paid workers. Universal credit rates had been raised above inflation, and families were promised expanded support in the form of free childcare for children as young as 9 months, as well as the nationwide rollout of breakfast clubs and free school meals. The government had also widened access to the warm home discount, doubling the number of qualifying households to 6 million for the coming winter. Uniform costs were being capped, and targeted programmes aimed to ease the pressure on households facing the steepest hikes in living costs. These policies, Starmer argued, would act as a buffer while the economy found its footing again. Yet economists and advocacy groups maintained that such steps would not be enough. Forecasts from the Resolution Foundation indicated that, despite these programmes, the poorest half of households would still be around £200 sterling, 0 pence, worse off by the time voters return to the polls. With energy, housing and food costs still outpacing earnings, critics warned that the measures amounted to temporary patches on a widening economic divide.
And thriving economy.
You'll recall last time we met, Prime Minister, I asked you about the government's decision to freeze the local housing allowance. And coming back to the issue around child poverty, this is an area which is keeping many children and their families in poverty because they cannot afford the rent. The recent data from the local government association responsible for all councils shows that there's a funding gap of around £7 million over the last 5 years. This is a key area pushing many people more into poverty. So I asked you again, Prime Minister, do you think that that was the right decision from a government that's ambitious on tackling child poverty?
Look, I think I defend the decisions we've made. Obviously, we head into the autumn. We will get to another budget. There'll be a chance to look again across the board. But we certainly made the right decision first time around. I think I'd also emphasise something I touched on last time, which is in the end, with housing, we need to build and make available more housing across the board. There simply isn't enough. And that
but
means
the starts,
price goes
Prime
up.
Minister, you may have seen are quite low. We're not building those houses quickly enough, and we will see more people and more children in poverty. We can't build our way out of this crisis. So in the interim, what more can the government do to help alleviate that poverty
Well,
that families
as I
are
say, there'll be
facing?
a child poverty strategy which we're setting out in the autumn. We will go into the budget in the autumn as well, and alleviating poverty is a priority of mine. I do think that we need to build more, though, and we have to build more because we've had a problem for many years of not building enough social and affordable housing in this country. And until we crack that problem, we will never be able to get to the fundamental roots of the failures here. And that's why, on that issue in particular, I'm pressing the Deputy.
The committee's questions soon turned to tax reform. Several members suggested that the government could ease the burden on working families by reshaping the tax system, particularly by aligning the taxation of investment income with that of wages. Proposals included revisiting capital gains tax, which critics argued disproportionately favoured the wealthy, and using the additional revenue to fund significant tax cuts for the working and middle classes. Australia's recent approach to similar reforms was cited as a model for delivering targeted relief without deepening fiscal deficits. Starmer, however, avoided committing to any such measures. He refused to signal whether tax adjustments would be part of the upcoming autumn budget, stressing that forecasts and formal decisions would be left to the Chancellor. His reluctance drew frustration from the committee, which accused the Prime Minister of sidestepping meaningful debate. For opposition voices, the evasiveness only reinforced claims that the government lacked a coherent plan to offset the financial pressures facing ordinary households. The standoff underscored the growing tension between the government's promises and the mounting scepticism over how it planned to meet them. With public trust already fraying, any failure to deliver meaningful relief could prove politically costly ahead of the next general election. The tone shifted sharply when Debbie Abrahams, a key committee member, addressed the government's welfare reforms. She cited her committee's recent findings on the Pathways to Work inquiry, warning that changes to universal credit and personal independence payment eligibility could push 250,000 disabled people into poverty. While she acknowledged minor concessions made to the legislation, she highlighted the fear and anxiety these changes had already created among those reliant on the system. Abrahams pressed Starmer for specifics on how his government would prevent further harm, noting projections that another 50,000 newly disabled individuals could face destitution within 8 months due to cuts in the universal credit health element. She challenged the Prime Minister's emphasis on encouraging employment for disabled citizens, pointing out that in many parts of the country there were hundreds of applicants for every single job suitable for those with disabilities. While Starmer argued that more could be done through partnerships with employers, he offered no immediate structural solutions beyond pilot programs and ongoing reviews. For many in the room, his response appeared insufficient, especially given the urgency of the crisis. The exchange highlighted a growing perception that welfare reform was being driven by budgetary concerns rather than the social values Labour had long championed. As the session drew to a close, Starmer defended his government's welfare overhaul as a difficult but necessary correction to a broken system. He pointed to the nearly 1 million young people currently out of work and not in education or training, warning that long-term unemployment at a young age often leads to a lifetime of low wages and instability. For Starmer, reforming welfare was not optional but essential to rebuilding pathways into secure employment, even if the process risked controversy. He admitted that mistakes had been made in recent weeks, acknowledging that the rollout of some policies had caused unnecessary anxiety among vulnerable groups. However, he argued that incremental reforms and employer-led initiatives could deliver results without requiring years of legislative wrangling. The challenge, he maintained, was to balance fiscal responsibility with Labour's historic commitment to fairness and opportunity. Despite his reassurances, the hearing ended with lingering unease. Critics warned that the measures risked deepening poverty for those least able to absorb the shocks, undermining the very values Labour claimed to protect. As the committee adjourned for recess, the divide between Starmer's vision and the lived reality of struggling families and disabled citizens remained stark, leaving questions about how his government would bridge the gap before facing voting. If you enjoyed this breakdown, please like and subscribe to the channel for more updates like this, and watch more videos here.